This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10. It's Monday, another week in which I have the enormous privilege of enjoying your company. When was the last time we got stuck into a story that was predicated upon the notion that they must know what they're doing? And then it actually turned out that they didn't. Listen, I know that it is lazy and wrong to subscribe to the idea that they're all the same as each other. I think that's one of the really dangerous little tropes that gets put out there by misinformation merchants and sundry other mischief makers. Clearly, the current government is nothing like the last few governments, not least because they haven't had time to do anything yet. But I do have that slight sense in the back of my head that I had a lot during COVID. And during COVID, I was horribly wrong. So were you. Do you remember we'd say, well, they must know what they're doing. They can't be making it up as they go along. They must be. There must be a reason why these people are getting the contract. They wouldn't be so blatant and so transparent as to just give contracts to their mates. Billions of pounds worth of contracts to their mates when the rest of the country approaches the crisis from the point of view of asking, what can I do to help? We were governed by people whose circle was absolutely populated by people who respond to a national crisis by saying, what can we do to make some money out of this? The inimitable Carol Vorderman is particularly powerful on this point. But the sense that there must be a plan dissipated pretty quickly, right? A secret plan that the likes of you and I, bears of very little brain, were unable to discern. We couldn't quite spot what the plan could be because it looked from where we were sitting that they'd made a terrible mistake, that they were doing something really stupid. I'm getting obsessed with lists at the moment. Have you noticed? Poor Eleanor, the producer of this programme, gets told to start making a list of things about every 20 minutes at the moment. Today I said, start making a list of the questions that we really like, the questions that sort of run through various conversations that we have, and you realise halfway through that in a way you're asking the same question that you were asking last week on a story that you thought was different. Like, how can you actually deal with a badly behaving child, for example? Popped up last week, and there's a story around today that in many ways leads us to the same, most effectively deal, most helpfully deal, leads us into the same territory. I kind of want to make a list of the things that we looked at the time and thought they are behaving like absolute imbeciles, politically speaking, if not morally. There must be something we can't see. It must be the case that there's something going on here that is more complicated than everything that is visible above the surface, right? And that is how I feel today about the winter fuel payments. Partly because of this story that Transparency International have unearthed about the sheer scale of corruption-adjacent PPE contracts that were doled out by Boris Johnson and his mates, doled out during that period. Because the figure is 15 billion, and the figure set to be raised by the cessation of winter fuel payments for millions of pensioners is a tiny fraction of that, isn't it? So the money's not enough. Hearing the head of Unite, was it Unite? It was the head of Unite, wasn't it? Sharon Graham this morning calling for a wealth tax. She's not the only one. The suggestion that people who have got in excess of £4 million could pay 1% on everything they own. And that's clear. Everything that's clear. So you wouldn't pay 1% on a £3 million house if half of it was still in hock to the building society or the bank. So 1% on everything you are. And you know, you sort of imagine what it would be like to be in that category. And you presume that if you were in that category, you'd be fine doing that. I wouldn't have any problem at all doing that. But it turns out that most of the people who are in that category probably would have a problem with it, which means that if we were, we probably would too. But you'd raise billions by doing that, potentially. You'd rate this. I mean, if you clawed back all the money that had been robbed from the taxpayer during the doling out of these COVID contracts, if you actually resurrected the investigations that Rishi Sunak stopped, some of these contracts, you'd probably raise loads more money, although them being clever and having fancy accountants, they'd be able to pay lawyers or something, or go bankrupt or whatever the arrangements would be. But the actual figure of how much will be raised by the winter fuel payment cessation is nowhere near enough at first glance to justify the political difficulties that it is already causing. And that's why I think there's something else going on here. There's no earthly way that Keir Starmer could have failed to understand that this would be Tinder. This would be, by that I mean firewood, not the dating app. This would be absolute jackpot territory for his enemies. The right-wing media, which is not a phrase we're going to stop using anytime soon, given that it still describes almost all of the print media in this country, an increasing proportion of the broadcast. They are going for him like a rat up the proverbial drainpipe, just as anybody would have been able to predict. You even open the door to that incredibly disingenuous comparison between old age pensioners and train drivers. Because remember, there's a certain type of Tory who hates nothing more than the idea of a working class citizen of this country earning 70 grand a year. How dare they? How very dare they? Rishi Sunak, £625 million in the bank, describing train drivers as well paid. What words would he use to describe himself? If a train driver is well paid, what is someone who's drawing down probably millions of pounds a year just by dint of owning shares? He could stay in bed all day and earn more than 100 train drivers in the course of the average year. But remember, train drivers are well paid, and the money that is going to stop rail strikes and to bring train drivers' pay back to parity with where it would have been before the Tories got in, that is money that should have stayed in the pockets of pensioners, including Richard Branson. All of them, all of the pensioners deserve this money. So she's looking to save, or they are looking to save, £1.4 billion a year. What's that phrase? There's a great figure of speech about numbers, isn't there? Some are too big. We can't get our head around the big numbers. So £1.4 billion a year, £15 billion worth of contracts. It's a penny on the pound of income tax, and everybody goes absolutely bonkers. So here's what I think, right? There must be more going on here than the simple necessity of raising money, because the political capital that is being expended is much greater than the financial capital that is being accrued. Does that make sense? That's an equation, right? So how much is it going to cost us in terms of goodwill and politics? And then that number is nebulous, that number is speculative, but, you'll see all the front pages. Starmer to give winter fuel rebels short shrift. You'll see Rishi Sunak returning, no doubt, to the question of train drivers, bloody train drivers, tycoon train drivers, driving those trains around with all that money. And they don't even use coal anymore on steam trains. They actually just shovel their own wages into the boiler to keep the train. Those train drivers get so much money, and they will continue with this line of attack. Axing of winter fuel payments was a cruel planned betrayal, according to someone who the Daily Express considered worthy of a front page, and it will continue. And then on the left, you will have a rebellion. The Guardian reports today that scores of MPs could refuse to back Starmer over cut in fuel payments. So I don't think, and listen, all of this now is open to debate. You could explain to me why £1.4 billion is a much more significant sum of money than I currently contend, or I currently believe. And you are welcome to challenge the idea that anything here is subtle or sophisticated or bubbling away below the surface. About 50 Labour MPs could refuse to back controversial plans. When you've got a majority of, I think, 174, you could sustain some of the largest parliamentary rebellions in the history of Parliament and still romp home untroubled. So that's an interesting political dynamic that we thought we were entering into in 2019. But of course, electing a prime minister based upon complete lies was always going to end badly. That hasn't happened here. You've got an enormous majority that he is prepared to compromise. He's prepared to take a hit on a big rebellion. And he's painted a target on his back for really obvious, if sometimes a bit lazy, attacks, comparisons with train drivers, or the demonisation of pensioners. And of course, crucially, he's upset people. He's possibly upset you. If you're going to lose your winter fuel payment, whether you need it or not, the idea that your purse is the first place that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves should have visited upon their mission to restore the nation's finances or improve the nation's finances, the idea that your purse or your radiator was the first port of call would be, I imagine, potentially quite obnoxious. Why me? Why is he coming for my winter fuel payment? And the prize is £1.4 billion. So, and also, Jen in Romford asks about, is the money saved worth a life? And what you need to do is Google how many pensioners die of the cold every year. It's a brutal reality, but it won't necessarily be because they couldn't afford to heat their homes. It will be because they were frightened of turning the heating on. And you need to be careful about that when you're conducting conversations like this. Nick had a call this morning from somebody saying, Keir Starmer should be prosecuted for murder if a single pensioner dies. Presumably completely ignorant of the fact, both of them, I presume, completely ignorant of the fact that the statistics for how many pensioners die of the cold every year are published every year. And no one was ever calling for Rishi Sunak to be prosecuted for murder when I think it was about 4,000 pensioners reportedly died of the cold, excess deaths caused by the cold. So, there are brutal calculations and brutal statistics here. But there's also politics, and we love politics. There's also politics. So on the credit side of this political decision, there is £1.4 billion. On the debit side, there is the painting of enormous and effective targets on their backs. There is the spurious but politically effective comparisons with the unions. Why are you giving money to workers? But they never say workers. They say, why are you giving money to the unions when you could be leaving it with pensioners? There is the opportunity for irresponsible journalists to claim that they don't care about old people. So much political capital in play that I would argue if you actually had an exchange rate whereby you could translate political capital into financial capital, where I am today at 10:15 on Monday morning, this looks to me like a really, really bad investment. The amount of political capital that they potentially squander, albeit at the beginning of a 5-year term, so there's plenty of room for it to come back, but the political capital they are squandering by doing this does not justify, to me, at the moment, until you start talking to me, the raising of a mere, and I use that word advisedly, a mere £1.4 billion. So why are they doing it? 0345 6060 973. If not just to raise money, if the reaction, the condemnation, the criticism, the castigation, if all of these things are actually factored in to the decision, then why are they doing it? It could be an epic miscalculation. There's plenty of room on the switchboard for you to make that case. They have made a terrible mistake. 0345 6060 973. Give me the whats, the whys, and possibly even the wherefores. But I doubt it personally because, for good or for ill, dull and detail driven describes both Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. At the moment, I still think for good. So detail-driven, very cautious, careful politicians have done something which expends enormous amounts of political capital, potentially, in pursuit of a relatively small amount of money. So why do you think they have done it? And, every day when I end my introduction, there's a little bit of me that can't wait to hear what your thoughts are on the question that I finally got around to asking. But I can't wait to hear it today. Thinking caps on, please. There's something much more complicated than a spurious comparison with train drivers or a lazy observation about wealth going on here. There is some politics in play that I can't currently discern. Can you? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 10. I'm sure the technology exists to calibrate my inbox more effectively, but sometimes it pings so much. It's like a ticker tape. It sort of just goes that I can't really send out specific inquiries until things have calmed down a bit. But the topics where we thought there must be a master plan that we couldn't see, if you can remember any that I've missed, then do feel free or indeed feel encouraged to remind me, where we sat here and I said, there must be something else going on here. They can't be that stupid. And it turned out that they were. And that is the question that we're asking today about the winter fuel payments and Labour's decision to pick one hell of a fight. I focused in the introduction on the right, but of course it's infuriating and enraging people on the left of their own party as well. So why are they doing it? Julia is in Kingston. Julia, what would you like to say?
Good morning. Hello.
Hello,
I honestly do think if you look at the political trajectory of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, that this is completely in line with their worldview. I think that going for the easy win, and as you can tell, I'm a traditional Labour voter.
How can I tell that?
By what I'm about to say.
Well, I'm not psychic, Julia. That's a first. You should, but on account of what I'm about to say, you should know exactly where I stand on this subject. Go on.
I always feel the need to have that as a
fair enough. I'm all ears
because I'm awaiting the attack. But I do think that going for an easy win, and the easy win is obviously the middle people, or the people below the middle people, rather than courageously going for the people who have, as you say, day after day, week after week, have made
I don't
so
understand.
much money.
I don't understand this argument. I mean, I hope that they do start framing some. I mean, the removal of VAT exemptions on school fees has very much targeted the most privileged people in the country, but there is, as you say, a hell of a lot further they could go. But Julia, hang on. They're under attack from everywhere. They're under attack from the left of their own party, from every right-wing journalist in the country. Keir Starmer can make Rishi Sunak can make comparisons with train drivers and attack trade unions. I just completely and categorically reject the idea that this is an easy win. It's an absolute skip fire of condemnation of criticism entirely of their own making.
It's a bad decision based on my own personal view, political views that are not aligned with mine. I voted Labour, but I cannot stand here and say that I think that the Labour Party has made a good decision when instead of going for people in this country who are well off have become more and more and more well off over the last 5 years.
Many of whom are pensioners. Many of whom are pensioners.
But that's fine. The people who are really well, I'm talking about the top 1% where you could make enormous wins. And this is what I thought a Labour Party stood for.
But you're not really answering my question, because the second part of it, so I completely reject the idea that it's an easy win for the reasons that I spent 20 minutes explaining. And the idea that it's an alternative to a wealth tax when it's going to raise a mere £1.4 billion actually blows up the economic argument that you're trying to make as well. It's nowhere near enough money. It's nowhere near enough money to put it on the same page as, for example, ramping up the top rate of income tax from 50% to 60%. So that doesn't work either.
But you can only be doing it then.
Yes.
However much you want to believe that they are in control and making rational decisions that you would agree with, they could only be doing it because that is what they politically believe is the right thing to do. Because, as you say,
taking money from people who they don't think need it.
But are they taking it from the people who have got the most? The people
by definition, it's means tested. There's just too many of them for your politics. No, you would rather it was a much smaller number of people at the top
that fall into the middle bracket.
And that's the 880,000 people that they want to sign up. I'm grateful to you for establishing before you said it that your position was based entirely upon opinions you had about them before the policy was announced. Because I think, and I don't mean this as a criticism, I think that's sort of slightly corrupted your thinking. You've arrived at the question I've asked today before I've asked it. You were the one that was being psychic. It's because Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are awful and they don't care about people and they're too kind to the rich.
No, that's not what I said.
Well, that's what everyone else heard.
No, that might be what you heard. That's not what I said.
So what did you say? In a sentence, because I've got to crack on.
What I said, that's absolutely fine. But what I said was there are many, many people in this country that are very, very well off and who could easily...
Yeah, but that's not really an answer to my question. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Is that you're right. So why have they chosen to do this? And your answer to that is because of your previously arrived at political conclusions, which may be correct, but it seems unlikely given what a vote loser it would be. We're going to go after the huge numbers of people on relatively ordinary incomes instead of the tiny number of people who support the Tories anyway, who are on enormous incomes. So it just doesn't work, I don't think. And forgive me if I arrive at 11 o'clock today realising that I'm wrong. But it doesn't work. It's the opposite of an easy win. Keeping you happy, keeping that attitude happy by increasing my income tax rate or bringing in a wealth tax would affect a tiny number of people. And therefore, according to your arithmetic, it would be much more popular. Except it wouldn't, for reasons that we may get onto a little later in the hour. Robert is in Leamington Spa. Robert, what would you like to say? What do you think they're up to?
Hi, James. Yeah. I think when I first heard this announcement, I was very worried for, not worried, but for wealth in general, because as soon as I heard it, I thought, right.
I lay awake at night worrying about wealth in general, Robert.
But
children being killed in Gaza, people struggling to feed their families, but we've got to look after wealth.
That came out wrong. What I meant to say was I knew pretty quickly that the fact they're prepared to do that and get that out so early, for the reasons you said, meant that in the background, when we get to late October, we'll look back and that will be trivial because of how I think they're going to go for money, wealth, whether it's being wealth tax, whether it's capital gains or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you've got no more proof of that than the last caller has evidence that they won't. So in a way, you're both addressing the same point from completely opposite positions, aren't you?
Yeah,
which is great.
So what I then think is that you'll look back and they'll look back, and for them to take that sort of flack, I don't particularly think they're idiots. I've been a Labour supporter from years ago, even though now I'm in business, but it looks to me like they can then look back and say, well, we are hitting wealth very hard now, but look at what we did to pensioners. They're putting their little bit in. It doesn't really affect growth, but that will look trivial, I think, and we'll soon find out within the next sort of 6 or 7 weeks. They've let it go a little bit too long because I think they've taken a bit of flack for probably longer than they would have liked to, but they know, stored up, that they've got no issues at all with this. When we look back in 2 months' time, we'll have this call and it'll be like, wow, I can see exactly what they were doing. That's my opinion.
I think it's a strong opinion, and it will be. We will know fairly quickly whether it's complete hokum or whether it is close to the money. And do you know? I wonder. This is the bit I find fascinating, Robert. I wonder whether, in their eyes, they have gone early. Because if you're right, then the more brouhaha and the more condemnation, the more attacks there are from the right and from the left. Yeah. Then the more powerful this tactic becomes, your suggestion becomes, if and when they do actually go after more obvious targets, because they turn around and say, oh, no, we're not. How can we possibly spare them when the pensioners are doing their bit?
Exactly. So I just think that's and I think it's actually a little bit more obvious than we think.
Don't do yourself down. You should be anointing yourself as the seer, the best seer so far of the week on LBC. You're the one that's cut through the weeds.
Thank you very much, sir.
No, you're very welcome. I like it a lot. I mean, does it work? We'll find out. 0345 606 0973. It works if and only if the first caller is pleased by what the second caller says is going to happen. That's the position from the left. From the right, could you seriously argue if they do come for higher earners? Or for me, as quite a high earner, I'm much more drawn to the idea of wealth taxes, alongside perhaps increases in income tax. But the assets, I've got a problem with this, and I know it sometimes makes me sound like an undergraduate. You should pay more tax on money you earn for doing nothing than you do on money you earn for working. Don't you think? Does that make me sound mad? So imagine I had £1 million worth of investments and I was making 100 grand a year on those, and then I was earning another 100 grand a year doing this. I must call my agent. I was earning another 100 grand a year doing this. Surely I should pay more tax on the 100 grand I'm making just for being rich than I am on the money I'm making for... I don't know. That's the kind of thing I suspect that everybody would like to see if we hadn't had our opinions so sort of mangled by decades of neoconservative and more traditionally right-wing rhetoric. It's 10:30. There's one phone line free, so grab it quickly if you want it. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:33 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I'm not in the mood for a political ding-dong necessarily on this, because it's not the central point of today's conversation, and this is well put, and I just don't get it. Maybe it's because I've never been one. I've always thought I must get more into investing. I've never really had the spare cash, but when I have, I've never sort of thought of it. I looked something up the other day I wanted to invest in. I wanted to... Can I say on air what I was thinking of investing in, or would that break Ofcom rules? I didn't invest. Well, there's a chocolate brand I rather like, but I thought that's going to be huge. And it turns out you can't really buy shares in it. And also, it's already pretty huge. So I've never got into that. Maybe if I had, I'd agree more with this from another James. Absolutely wrong. Investing money is a risk. It creates jobs, adds more production capacity, which has multiple benefits to the economy. If you're taxed too much, the risk wouldn't be worth it and investment would contract. So the idea that if you were taxed the same on your investments as you are taxed on your investment income as you're taxed on your working income, I just don't see it as controversial, or maybe not even the same, just more than you are now. Because you know what they say, James, when you hear the gambling adverts on the telly or the radio, they say don't gamble what you can't afford. So don't invest what you can't afford. And then the risk that you take is mitigated by the fact that you can afford to lose it. No one is going to invest money in the stock market that they can't afford unless they are addicts, gambling addicts. So I passionately reject your position, although I do respect it up to a point, and I do understand it. So that's where I'd go. Dan Needle, the tax expert who was responsible for bringing Nadeem Zahawi to his knees, although judging by Nadeem Zahawi's public conduct, he didn't notice. He's strong on this. He's explained why wealth taxes are rhetorically very attractive, but economically not necessarily very effective. So I would look at things like that. I'd look at capital gains. I'd look at that kind of money-raising tactic. And when people start squealing, Keir Starmer can turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, the pensioners are doing their bit, why aren't you? And the same with the unions. So you heard in the news there, Thomas explaining, the unions are complaining about the withdrawal of winter fuel payments. He can turn around to the unions and say, excuse me, how on earth do you think, unless we carry on with a programme of money saving, how on earth are we going to actually be able to give your members the salaries that they deserve? So the pensioners give Rishi Sunak some temporary political capital, but moving forward, if Starmer comes after those of us who seem to be more deserving targets of taxation, then he can turn around to the unions and say, you see, everyone has to do their bit, otherwise we can't do the good stuff. Russell's in Ashford. Russell, what do you think?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Russell.
I'm a first-time caller.
Welcome.
I'm a bit of a fan, and I'm not nervous because it's only you.
Thank you. That's exactly that. Be more Russell. Be more Russell. Carry on, mate.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head earlier on, James, when you said, like, speaking of a 5-year term. Now is the time when Labour has a massive majority to do whatever they want. Just hit it hard, right? And in 5 years' time, it'll all be forgotten. If basically they did this towards the start, the start of the next election, it'd be a massive vote loser. You wouldn't do it a month out, would you? A month out from going to the country, tell the pensioners they're losing their winter fuel allowance. Exactly. Just do it now. Just do it all now. So I'm sure will come the budget, they'll go for CGT and everything else. I'm sure, as your astute previous caller said, you know, they can then say, look, we're doing this. We also did the pensioners, and we're doing everybody for the right reasons. So I think Keir Starmer's completely right. At the end of the day, it's not as though they're removing the bloody thing. It's simply saying that it means tested. They're still giving it to people who need it. I'm not getting it. No, I'm not complaining. No, I mean, it is literally means tested because there is a cut-off point. Although I got one message suggesting that because there is a cut-off point, it's not means tested. But I didn't quite. That person's a simpleton. Well, that's a bit unkind, albeit accurate. No, it is. It's true, but what about the idea then that it's a good policy, but the cut-off point is in the wrong place? Quite possibly. Yeah. Yeah, so but that's not the same. That's not as big a weapon as it being a disastrous or a dastardly policy, is it? Entirely correct, James. You've done it again.
See. Well, thank you, Russ. I look forward to call number 2 when you'll be even less not nervous.
I can do that, James.
You'll be even less not nervous next time.
No, James, I've had my fill now. It's
Is that it? No, that's it. That's the bucket list ticked off. All right. Well, I loved it. It was good for me. 10:38 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The period between 2021 and 2022. I'm looking at. I'll find you the number in a minute. The number of deaths that are attributed to pensioners being cold is already unconscionably high. So I'm brutal, though this analysis is. The claim that is going to be politically damaging to Keir Starmer if you had absolutely nothing to say when it was being presided over by Rishi Sunak is obviously bogus. It's pure footballification. But here's something they could do. And then you've got cold-related illnesses. You're looking at about 25,000 people every year, according to Age UK. But here's something you could do. You want to make sure that the 880,000 people who are eligible for pension credits not currently signed up for them and therefore not getting the winter fuel payment that they are entitled to. You move heaven and earth to get them all signed up. But you also do a little bit of, what would you call it? You do a bit of panic management. You know, energy bills are coming down. The idea of someone who can afford to turn the heating on but doesn't. We've spoken to them on this programme. We've spoken to their children on this programme. And that's when, you know, some of those nice old-fashioned public service advertisements might be quite helpful. But I don't know how you break through that mindset. The idea of someone sitting there shivering in the cold when they don't need to is heartbreaking. The idea of someone sitting there shivering in the cold because they need to, well, that's disgusting. 10:40 is the time. Graham is in Bracknell. Graham, what would you like to say?
Hello, good morning.
Hello, Graham.
I agree a bit with what Russell said when he mentioned 5 years ahead, looking at the next election. But I believe, generally speaking, that older people vote Conservative and middle-aged younger people tend to vote Labour.
Yes.
I think that's what happens. I'm of the opinion that they're doing this, hitting older people, to show the younger group of people that they're not scared of anybody, even these old people they've got their winter fuel allowance, they've got their pensions. A lot of people are lucky enough to have paid off their mortgage. They've got all this good stuff, and while you're trying to get together,
and I think for the reasons you allude to, Graham, the political impetus has been directed for 14 years very, very much to looking after these people.
Yes.
And so Starmer is announcing, in a sense, a changing of the guard. We will no longer prioritise the comfort of the already comfortable over the conditions of the young and comparatively struggling.
Yes, and he's doing it now because there's 5 years to forget about it.
Do you think it'll work?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, I'm beginning to think it might as well.
I do think it will work. I think it's quite a cynical move, really. But I think that's my reasoning for why they're doing it. I can't see any other reason why they're doing it, because I might be wrong. But I think if you've got your state pension, if you've got a private pension as well, very often that tops it up and you have to pay income tax.
Yes.
So I would have thought from that information they could work out who's got the biggest second pension that you're paying tax on, and they could tax those people or reduce their winter fuel allowance.
Well, you and I aren't. We don't know. Sometimes I think, why aren't they doing it like that? And why aren't they doing it like this? It must be easy. And then it turns out it would actually be more expensive than the money it would save. But the idea, on the other side of the argument from this being good politics, albeit cynical, the idea that it's a good policy with a bad cut-off point is one that's pretty hard to argue with, I think, depending, of course, on how many people are pushed into genuine problems by it.
Yeah.
We shall see. Can I ask whether you're affected by it or not?
Yeah, I am. I'm lucky enough that I've paid off my mortgage. I'm in the position where I've got my and my wife, we're both retired. We've got our state pensions. I've got a small private pension, which I pay tax on. But we will lose our winter fuel allowance this year, yeah.
And will you, I mean, to be simplistic, will you notice?
I don't want to give the impression I've got money.
No, I know, but it's not millions. It's not thousands of pounds.
No, it's not. No, It's very likely that we'll put a few adjustments. It won't bother us too much.
And again, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to make those adjustments. Beatrice tells me, and I've got no reason to doubt her statistics, that over 80% of pensioners are not in poverty. The average pensioner is as wealthy as the average worker. There are fewer than 20% of pensioners in poverty. Imagine there's some theory or political idea of redistribution from the wealthiest to those in most need. And then we could add to that list water companies, VIP lane, corrupt procurement beneficiaries, and that 1% of wealth too. But I'm okay with the means testing of winter fuel allowances. You just want to be sure. And the problem is, with any cut-off point, how many times have we said this? The problem with any cut-off point, whether it's child benefit or whether it's winter fuel payment, is there's going to be someone who's pennies shy of it. Pennies shy of getting it. Someone who's going to be £300 worth off because they're £10 under the threshold that they need to be over in order to get the £300. And those are the ones that you need to look after. So a taper, I think I've heard talk of a taper. I'm in favour of tapers. I sound like Boris Johnson. I'll come to Joseph first after the break, because I'm actually hitting my junctions on time for once today, and I think it's good to try to keep these things up. It's coming up to 10:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Coming up a little later on the programme, we will speak to, I think, the Chief Executive of Transparency International about this extraordinary and yet not remotely surprising story of corruption red flags being attached to some £15 billion worth of those so-called COVID contracts, which mysteriously saw enormous sums of public money make their way into the pockets of business people and companies, some of which had only been set up yesterday, very, very, very closely allied to senior members of the Conservative Party and the last 2 or 3 Conservative governments. And I also want to get you a proper explainer. We were going to do this on Friday, but I'm afraid we fell foul of transatlantic time differences and completely forgot what that difference is between here and Washington. So we will be speaking to a Washington Post journalist about this growing story in America, which points towards, and I know some of us have suspected it, even indeed insisted and explained it for a long time, but you still need, the more proof the merrier, growing evidence of unsavory Russian-inspired influence upon public discourse, quite deliberately manipulated, including, in the case of the latest story to emerge in America, some of the most prominent voices on the sort of pro-Trump and coincidentally pro-Kremlin right. It's 10:45.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:48 is the time. The latest, I mentioned this to you almost as a kind of grim irony, didn't I, on Friday, that the latest module of the COVID hearings, the COVID inquiry, gets underway today, looking at the impact upon children and schools. But in the shadow of what we discovered about Grenfell Tower last week, you realise the importance and urgency of that. We'll definitely be catching up on events there, if not today, then this week. But, you know, if you're watching that while also listening to this, because you're perfectly capable of doing 2 things at once, which means you're quite probably a woman, then do feel free to give me a heads up on things that you think that we might be missing. It's not the BBC. I haven't got a great army of people actually following the COVID inquiry so that we can cover it properly on air. 10:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Back to the question of what Keir Starmer is up to, because there's a consensus. You're perfectly entitled to think that he's as thick as mince, or that he hates pensioners and that he's doing this because he's as thick as mince and he hates pensioners. But even as you munch upon your gammon flakes for breakfast, you probably recognise that's not a very intelligent analysis. So what is he up to? Why is he expending such enormous amounts of political capital in the short term for financial capital that, even in the long term, is not that big? Joseph's in Stroud. Joseph, what would you like to say?
Right. Well, James, first I want to thank you for having this conversation the way you're having it, because you're bringing nuance and you're aiming to bring light as opposed to just smoke and heat.
I hope so. But I'll take the compliment. I'll take the win, Joseph.
So far, so good.
Yes.
So far, so good.
Yes. Don't mess it up. Don't mess it up.
Well, I'll do my best. So far, I like all the contributions that other people have made, particularly the one around, when money starts to squeal as their pips are being squeezed. Yes. Everybody can point at the old age pensioners and say, well, hey, look, we did that to them. You guys, zip it. We need your money. Although money will always squeal. But I think there's another dimension to this as well, and that is that it gives Starmer an opportunity to flush out some of the unreliable hard left within his party, those who are kind of sitting there latent, squatting in the back, whom he can't necessarily rely on when the really hard votes come down.
That's interesting. I'd probably challenge your description of them as unreliable hard left. I think so. If there are 50,
Jeremy Corbyn, who voted against.
Well, he's not in the Labour Party anymore. But I don't think there are 50 Labour MPs who are prototype Jeremy Corbyns. I think some of the people planning to vote against this will be voting with their consciences and with their integrity intact. They're not sort of professional troublemakers or termagants.
But I'm thinking, like, with the what's going to need to happen within the next 5 years, I don't know if people really have the luxury to be voting with their conscience on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's a good point.
On things which we don't know the details of. Like, we don't know what's actually going to be in the budget. We don't know what it's actually going to look like. So right now, these people are going to be voting on speculation. And if they're going to be voting with their conscience on speculation without having read what's actually in the detail, come on, man. Really get in line until we know what the detail is.
I need to know where you are, because one thing I think we've learned about Keir Starmer is he is not the sort of ineffectual and frightened of confrontation character that when he first came to public prominence we thought perhaps he was. I mean,
this is real power. This is real power, and real power has the needs of real power. And that's what matters when you wield it.
Let me read you this from Graham. I think it's directed at me rather than you, but you can handle it. You're tying yourself in knots trying to explain a nonsensical, divisive and ineffective policy. Maybe they're just not very good at this. I think Graham is the guy who also sent in the claim that a cut-off point according to money isn't actually means testing. So be gentle with him. Are you tying yourself in knots trying to explain a nonsensical, divisive and ineffective policy?
Maybe, and I guess we'll see when the actual budget drops.
That's what comes up, isn't it? So it does feel, the more you talk about it, Graham accepted that there is rather more going on here than a simple and unnecessary targeting of pensioners.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in this, right? You know, you never let something like this go to waste in full. And I like all the contributions that people have made, because they're all like, yeah, no, absolutely, this is what's going on, and yeah, that's really useful, and yeah, that's really useful.
And it gives, you can see what it gives him. Moving forward, the ammunition it provides. But we cannot rule out the two other alternatives, which is they've made a terrible miscalculation. If you want to articulate this position with the same sort of level of insight and intelligence that we've heard so far, 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need, or that it is a kind of ideologically driven abomination. It's something really, really grim, deliberate and grim, which seemed to be the position that was being adopted from the left. So, again, feel free to articulate that further. Joseph, thank you. And thank you for the kind words. I try. I do my best. You're always better off on a Monday, I think, when energy levels are high. Susan's in Croydon. Susan, what would you like to say?
Well, I don't think it's a miscalculation, and I tend to agree with what your other caller said, which is that it's part of a bigger package of things that's coming through the line. Now, they couldn't in July do a budget, right? They need to take some time to think about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. However, if they figured that they need to actually, if they're going to share the pain with everybody, including the pensioners, so that it's fair, then if they were going to do something about the winter fuel allowance, they had to announce it in July. Why? And because people need time to actually plan. If they announce, can you imagine
just to be clear, it's a rhetorical question, that why, but I'm afraid I hadn't clocked it before. Is it in the winter is the reason why it had to be announced in July?
Yeah, well, no, but you get what I mean.
I'm just acknowledging my own stupidity in the face of what you thought was a rhetorical question. Yes. So because an earlier caller said, I think they made a mistake going so early. And I should have been able to say, well, there's one big reason why they did that. Winter.
Exactly,
yes.
Yeah. And they had
winter is coming.
Plan. Yeah. And that way they give people the time, the people that haven't applied for the pension credit that need to, it gives them time to do it. It gives, everybody time so that they're not running around like chickens with their heads cut off at the last minute. And then the other thing, because then the other thing they pair it to is, well, why did they give the pay rises to, the
train drivers?
The train drivers. And
Don't mention the poorly paid train cleaners or the guards or the station staff, or just mention the people at the very top of the railway wage structure.
Workers. Can we just call them workers?
No,
you said that
absolutely not, because then we'd have to distinguish them from the managers who already get paid way more than the train drivers do.
Call them wage earners. Call them people that actually earn money, that pay taxes, that then fund the things that we want them to fund.
Them comrades.
So you need to actually make sure that they have money to be able to buy food, be able to heat their homes, because the working people, so the non-pensioners, well, some pensioners pay tax, but by and large, the people that actually work and contribute taxes to the exchequer are the ones that fund the pensions. So yes, you do need to take care of them. I'm sorry.
We could call it, in chronological terms, we could call it trickle-up economics.
Exactly. So that's why I think, obviously, if they come out with a budget in October that doesn't tax people sort of more widely across the wealth spectrum, then I agree with the other callers.
That's the problem, isn't it? That's the problem. And I think that the rhetoric surrounding tax increases that we're also being softened up for, because there's £22 billion black hole, which some people, of course, dispute. Nobody disputes the existence of, but there is still some argument over how genuinely surprised Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves could have been to discover it. That gives them space in which to retreat from pledges made before the discovery of the £22 billion
I'm also
black
inclined to give them. I'm inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt, because if we think about the lies and the obfuscation and the hiding of the truth and the doing stuff that doesn't make sense that we had in the last iteration of the Conservative, I completely believe that there is a very strong chance that they did actually hide stuff. And the fact that there's actually investigation going into it tends to support it. So,
and even if they did,
even
if they didn't, you could, if all of these contracts that are corruption adjacent, according to Transparency International this morning, if you were to claw back all of the money awarded in these allegedly dodgy contracts, it would still take you 15 years to raise the same sum from the withdrawal of winter fuel payments. So you're right that the rearview mirror is at least as important as the road ahead when it comes to discussing these matters. Thank you, Susan. Last word on this, I think, to Laura, who's in Coventry. Laura, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Privileged to speak to you.
Oh, come off it. The pleasure's all mine. Carry on.
Thank you. I think it's a question of equality for me. I'm not a Labour voter. I haven't voted Labour since 1997, but I'm on the left of politics.
Yes.
There's lots of families that can't pay their bills. There's lots of people with disabilities that aren't able to work, can't pay their bills.
Yes.
Why are we giving a blanket subsidy to all pensioners when there's lots of richer pensioners that don't need it?
I think that is a rhetorical question, and it was touched on by an earlier caller who was himself a pensioner, who will be losing the winter fuel payment, who pointed out that a lot of economic policy for the last 14 years has been driven by the knowledge that the older you are, the more likely you are to vote Tory.
And a lot of pensioners don't have mortgages.
So why are you getting this money? Answer, because you're more likely to vote Conservative. Here's £300 a year that you just don't need.
Yeah, and it's not taxable either. Even if you were to, tinker around the edges, as you said, change the threshold. If you made it taxable or just added it to the state pension, at least all those rich people would be paying tax on that income.
Laura, I said it would be the last word, and what a good word it is. Many thanks indeed. So that's why I take the kind words of Josephine Stroud to heart. It's why sometimes digging behind the obvious can be a lot more fruitful. It can yield much more fertile ground than just getting that bloke in Liverpool who seems to ring every presenter on LBC to shout about how he's never going to vote Labour again. That's what happens if you ask a very simple and simplistic question about winter fuel payments. So thank you for that. Once again, proving that the calibre of calls that I have the privilege of harvesting every day is higher than ever. I don't quite know what we're going to do next. There's a fascinating story about the role that university education plays for people from unprivileged or less privileged backgrounds, and also one about why teachers should be calling out more bad parents.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11 is the time. What are your favourite conversations out of all the ones that we have together? If I'm to be appallingly self-referential for a moment, how much does my attitude affect your enjoyment? So I enjoy the ones most where I'm actually a little bit torn. Statistics suggest that the more popular ones are the ones where I have absolutely no doubt about what my opinion is. I scream it from the rafters and the clip goes viral shortly afterwards. But in terms of interaction and conversation, the ones where I'm not quite sure what to think are the ones where I most enjoy hearing from you. And I note this morning that I have fallen. Well, I am surprised to find myself in the position that I find myself in. And it is Peter Kyle, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, who has pushed that button. Do you know how Peter Kyle ended up at university? He's not a household name yet, is he, Peter Kyle? I'm not sure he's a household name in his own household yet. But he's very much a coming man in the Labour government, as is evinced by the fact that he's now Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, which, if we are to take many of the words of Keir Starmer and his colleagues at face value, that is going to once again become an incredibly important position. I say once again because previously we had a Prime Minister who was discouraging people, particularly from poorer backgrounds, discouraging them from going to university. You will remember that he was talking about low-value degrees and essentially, I think, talking to people from lower incomes and discouraging them from going to university when nobody in his social circle or professional realm would contemplate that future for their own children. I don't know whether it is a fair memory, but I remember interviewing Joe Johnson some years ago about some scheme he had for higher education, and I asked him whether he'd contemplate encouraging his own children to go down that path. And he looked at me as if I'd just asked him to dance naked around Westminster Palace on the day of the King's speech. So some of these, and he's one of the good guys, comparatively speaking, relatively speaking. The idea when people are making policy, this is the big difference for me between right and left, right? And you might not like it, but I'm afraid it's just true. Is that when the left frame their policies, they are framing their policies essentially for everybody. They believe that your child, if you are on 20 grand a year, has as much right to go to university as I do. Now, there is imperfection across the system, tuition fees. Labour bear responsibility for some of the obstacles that now exist between your child or your friend's child and university. But the system is such that it has become more possible in many ways than ever before. And that seems counterintuitive, given that once it would have been free, and now it involves quite hefty loans, but the statistics tell us that it is actually happening. So education, education, education being Tony Blair's mantra when he came into Downing Street, and the determination to see, I think it was up to 50% of the relevant age group making their way into tertiary education beyond A-levels. Somehow, and this is why I feel a bit, well, at the moment I feel a little bit ashamed of what I'm about to tell you. But it may well be that you end up telling me, no, you were right to feel that way, and Peter Kyle is wrong. But do not let me forget to tell you about how Peter Kyle ended up at university, the current Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. So it's just a beautiful story. It's a really lovely story. So I am a little bit ashamed to tell you that I think I fell for it. I think I've bought into this. I can't say I fell for it because that means I'm prejudging it as being fallacious when it might actually be true. I kind of bought into the idea that too many people were going to university. When Rishi Sunak started talking about rip-off degrees, I kind of thought some young people are being let down here. They're being encouraged to sign up for things that my late father would once have called a Mickey Mouse course. He didn't invent that phrase. Obviously, you've heard it before. And at the end of that period, then they're going to look back and think that they wasted their time. Now, of course, some people will look back and think that they wasted their time. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. You know, it's a bit like the people who've never had a cold thinking that the common cold doesn't exist. You don't derive sweeping conclusions from one experience. Or in other words, the plural of anecdote is not data. The data tells us that going to university, getting a degree will help you. It will increase your chances in life. And I didn't see it myself, but the person who told me about it is a very reliable source. A pal of mine was at the Financial Times Festival this weekend, which looked absolutely brilliant. In fact, the double-headed with the head of the CIA and the head of MI6 about the threat to the current world order and some of the things on the horizon that we should be facing together. We looked at amazing. We may have a little look at that later in the week. My pal who was at that festival went to a John Byrne Murdoch event, and John Byrne Murdoch is, I think his official title is King of Graphs at the Financial Times. He puts together data. I use him a lot in my book, actually, in How They Broke Britain. 18 weeks in the Sunday Times top 10 as of yesterday. He puts together graphs and statistics that are easier to digest than almost any others I've ever seen. And my friend was telling me that the statistics, particularly for young men, if they don't go to university, and their subsequent economic performance are chilling. And he was approaching it from the point of view of wondering whether his 18-year-old should or should not go to university. And he was pretty 50-50 about it when he walked into this room. And then he saw the statistics showing it's different for women for reasons that I don't understand. But for young men, not going to university has a measurable and permanent effect upon their future wealth. And we know now from all the conversations we've had, if we didn't know before, that future wealth means future health. Future wealth means future happiness. All of these things. Money can't buy you love, but goodness knows it can buy you choices, and choices make you happier. The more freedoms that you have, the more opportunities that you have, the more avenues that are open to you, the nicer your life will feel, whether you appreciate it at the time or not. So the idea that Rishi Sunak was very, very keen on, that people from poorer backgrounds shouldn't go to university, attacks on so-called rip-off degrees from the former Prime Minister, Peter Kyle suggests today, risked putting off future innovators and scientists. So in a way, we're going to talk about the relationship between class and degrees, okay? We're going to talk about the idea that a Labour government should absolutely be encouraging people from a working class background to get degrees. And we're going to have a little look at why the Tory party under Rishi Sunak was so keen to discourage them from doing so. Because I would bet my house that there's no earthly way they would support these ideas for their own children. And remember, the better the school that you went to, or the more money that you paid to educate your children, the higher their chances of getting into, quotes, better, end quotes, universities. So you don't have cleverer children by dint of being able to afford to send them to private school. You just end up with better educated children, and better educated children are more likely to get into universities, or better universities. But what a good university will do is take the bright child who hasn't had the best education, recognise their potential, polish them, and send them out into the world 3 years later, much, much, much better equipped for success than they would have been without the degree, than they would have been without the university education. So two things. First of all, how Peter Kyle ended up at university, which is one of the loveliest stories I've heard in a long time. And then we'll have a look at what the relationship is between working class and university degrees. So Peter Kyle was working at the Body Shop. I don't know whether he was in a shop or whether he was in the warehouse, but he was putting in particularly long hours. And the late Dame Anita Roddick, the founder of the Body Shop, noticed him. He caught her eye by dint of his work ethic and the amount of effort that he was putting in. So Anita Roddick took him to one side and encouraged him to go to university. Indeed, she encouraged him to apply to her own alma mater, to the university that she'd attended, Sussex University, who turned him down. Do you know what she did then? I mean, this is lovely. In a way, it's a sad story, because not everybody will have an Anita Roddick in their corner when this happens to them. And this would have happened to some people last week. No, she didn't pay. She threatened to return her honorary degree. Oh, I don't know if it was her alma mater. I just know that she had an honorary degree from there. Alma mater means other mother, Keith. It's Latin. So she threatened to return her honorary degree. Cost my father 50 grand, that, mate. So I hope he kept the receipts. Threatened to return her honorary degree unless they admitted Peter Kyle into the university. And, I mean, at risk of getting a bit dewy-eyed about a politician, which is not something I enjoy doing, my goodness me, he's rewarded her faith in him, hasn't he? By becoming Secretary of State for Science, Technology and Innovation. So he's working in the body shop, and the owner spots him. Says, that lad's got something. Why don't you apply to university? At that point in his life, he didn't have the tools needed even to get into university, but she knew. So she intervened in an extraordinary and exceptional way and got him into university. And 30 years later, I wish it would have been amazing if she'd lived to see it. He's Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. So you show me a better qualification for knowing the role that university can play in the lives of people who would not ordinarily have considered it an option for them. What possible better communication could you have had? They gave me the lowest paid job in the company, inputting invoices, which was the worst job in the world for me, but I only found out later in life because I was so profoundly dyslexic. I was terrible at the job, but I loved the company, so I used to go in on a Sunday and work my socks off secretly so that I could stay up to date with everything. And that's how I met Anita, because she spotted me working on a Sunday. He applied twice to Sussex, got rejected both times, went back to school at 25 to get the qualifications that he needed, applied again, got rejected again, and then a few days later he got an acceptance. This is Peter Kyle talking to The Guardian last night. I only found out sometime later because her PA told me that Anita had called the university and said, if you don't have Peter Kyle as a student, I'm returning my honorary doctorate. That is how I got in. And he's now in a job, which means he can help people from backgrounds similar to his, or in situations similar to his, get into university without an Anita Roddick-shaped intervention. So how the hell did I end up thinking that too many young people were going to university? And was I necessarily wrong? Peter Kyle could be wrong. I don't necessarily want well, I do want anecdotes, don't I? But I really value overviews. I really value bigger picture stuff on the question of class. I can't do a phone-in on what's the relationship between class and degrees, can I? It's a bit ambitious, isn't it, for a radio phone-in? What's the relationship between class and degrees? If you want to have a crack at that, I'll give you the money myself. But what it speaks to, what it leads to, is this question of whether or not we want to live in a country where people from below middle class backgrounds have as much access to university as people from middle class and upwards backgrounds. And the more I think about that, the more I find myself wondering how on earth I could ever have ended up entertaining the notion that too many people were going to university, too many school leavers were going to university. So we've got two questions. The first is you. What's your story? If you're from a background where you were not necessarily expected to go to university, what effect did it have on the rest of your life? 0345 6060 973. What effect did going to university from a background not where that wouldn't be expected, what did it do? What did it change? What would you say in response to the suggestion that too many people from your background go to university now? 0345 6060 973. And the second question, given that we're going to be talking a heck of a lot about the Labour Party in the weeks, months and years moving forward, why do you think, and I want you to offer up good faith answers to this, defensive answers if you like, answers that don't make him sound like an unpleasant individual. Why did Rishi Sunak want to stop children from lower income families going to university? He never said that out loud, but he sure as biscuits didn't mean his own kids, did he? Why was that? What's that actually about? How could a former Goldman Sachs trader with £625 million in the bank convince himself that your children shouldn't be going to university? What's that about? Politically, personally, economically, socially, ideologically? I don't know. What difference did it make to you? What difference is it currently making to you? And why did the last iteration of the Tory party end up opposed to university degrees for people not like them? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 11. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The Science Minister declares an end to the Conservatives' war on higher education. Question 1. Why did they wage it? Gary suggests it's just simple know your place politics. I think he's probably right, isn't he? But you're welcome to put some flesh on those bones. And question number 2. What did higher education do for you as somebody from a less affluent background? Peter Kyle, this is greatly phrased. He says, not to people... Well, he said, the value of an undergraduate degree has been called into question by the previous government, and that is a psychological barrier. Not to people who come from affluent, assertive families, but to people from lower incomes, for whom the consideration of money has a far more direct impact on their lives because their families live and breathe it every day. And I think he knows of what he speaks, which marks quite a difference, doesn't it? Quite a departure from the previous regime. Becky is in Brighton. Becky, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James.
Hello, Becky.
So I think Peter Kyle and I grew up in almost the same circumstances, in the same area, actually. I grew up in the shadow of the Body Shop, about 10 years apart.
Does that mean that you still smell of white musk?
I've still got those little soaps that are shaped like animals.
The shadow. We all grew up in the shadow of the Body Shop, but you're talking geography, not hygiene. Not hygiene. Yes.
She could have been anywhere, but she came back to where she grew up because Littlehampton, LA, as people call it, Little Hampton, was one of the most underprivileged coastal towns in the UK at the time that I think Peter and I, well, I think I'm a little bit younger than him, but we were growing up. It was the teenage pregnancy capital of Europe.
Gosh.
I got straight A stars in my 4 A-levels. I was primed for Oxford. Decided to take a year out, fell pregnant, and then became... It's very difficult to explain.
Well,
but
so you can take your time, or you can not, but you don't have to. So it's entirely up to you.
Yeah, no. What I'm trying to kind of clarify is the attitude to your own success.
Yes.
When you come from somewhere like that, is very difficult to explain because there's tall poppy syndrome. You know, you don't want to be too aspirational because that cuts you off from people who around you. There's a lot of poverty. Yeah. But also, you know, there's something in you that isn't quite fulfilled. So I had my children, and then when I was 27, I looked at them and I thought, one 5-year-old, one 1-year-old, and I thought, I've been writing, I've been, journaling, I know that I can do something. So having just been working behind a bar, I applied to the University of Brighton, and I got an unconditional offer and uprooted the children from where we were living, moved to Brighton, and I cannot tell you the difference that made to my life. You know, from coming from a place where it was just kind of thought that you would settle down, have a council flat. Nothing wrong with having a council flat at all.
I understand what you're saying.
You know, your aspirations were so limited. And then suddenly you're surrounded by these people who are looking at you. And I had no idea how good I actually was, right? I literally didn't know because there was nothing around me to reflect it. And until you're in those academic institutions, you don't have time for yourself. You don't have time to think about, you know, sort of congenital ideas. You know, they don't actually teach you subjects. They teach you how to think about subjects, and that's where I think he's entirely right.
That's great critical thinking you describe. But I hope this doesn't come out patronising. I don't think it will, but I'm apologising in advance in case it does. You're obviously exceptionally bright. I think you had a place at Oxford, didn't you, before you got pregnant? And from a background like yours, achieving a place at Oxford is an extraordinary achievement. From a background like mine, it isn't. So what about people who aren't exceptionally bright, whatever background they're from? How confident can we be that they're like a Jacob Rees-Mogg, for example, in a shell suit rather than in a ludicrous Victorian cosplay? How could we be confident that someone like him would benefit from that level of education when he's not that bright?
It's more than just the education. It's the learning to work with people. It's learning to learn from people. Obviously, when I went to university, I did meet people from privately educated backgrounds that I'd not met before. But also, you know, what it allowed me to do, because I was a little bit older than the rest of them, I kind of became a little bit of a mentor. But then they would
you said mentor, right? Yeah, I know. I thought for a minute I did a double take. I thought you said I became a little bit of a mental, and I thought, what's going on here? This has taken quite a turn.
That's a little Hampton accent coming out.
That's the LA. Yeah,
LA. That's the LA. Yeah, LA massive.
So you wanted to pass on to other people the benefits of what you had enjoyed.
Oh, gosh, and also
like Peter Kyle, Kyle.
Learning for learning's sake.
Yeah.
Yes. It allows you to get out of your own kind of mindset, get away from sort of tropes, you know. Yeah. And as I say, the younger people that I was at university with, some of them almost 10 years younger than me, they learned from my children. My daughter, I used to have to take her to lectures. She was 7. Gosh. We were doing law. And she got a certificate because she would put her hand up. She, you know, and that gave her the drive to, because I was the first person in my generation to go to university. That gave her, she's now at university. That gave her the drive to go to uni. So, you know, it's something that you can't ever put people down for. Ever.
Well, and you've expressed it quite perfectly with that added bonus of being adjacent to Peter Kyle in so many ways. And you might not want to do this, and you might not be minded to, but the obviousness of what you describe is such that you wonder quite what drives people who resist it. Perhaps the most pertinent phrase you uttered was learning for learning's sake. Why wouldn't? But because they don't value it, because they think, well, hang on, I can't immediately transfer that into money. What's the point of studying this if it's not going to be immediately commoditized? That learning for learning's sake seems to be what they have a problem with. If we're being kind, if we're being unkind, the more of a beneficiary you are from an unequal status quo, the more spooked you'll be by the idea of people like you breaking out of it.
And that's exactly it. It's raising the ladder after you, you know, isn't it? That's the way I see it. The more educated a population, the more critical thinking you have, the more you look at the last 14 years, etc., and think, wow, that's rubbish. The more people actually read into the headlines and don't just see what's on the front page.
That idea, actually, that we talked about last week of the effort put into persuading people to vote against their own interests, whether it's sort of trade union membership or even European Union membership, speaks to... Well, McNoodles goes a little further in this tweet that I think you'll enjoy. University teaches critical thinking regardless of the discipline studied, and critical thinkers don't vote Conservative. Phone in over. Sorry, James. Well, clearly wrong.
I mean, yes, but also I remember going to university, there were student discounts on the doors in some of the nightclubs I used to go to. And I remember complaining, well, they don't pay their taxes. And I look back on that with so much shame.
Well, you shouldn't do that. I remember a bloke showing me his payslip. He was livid that his taxes were paying for me to go to university. And it was a moment for me. It was a formative moment because I realised that there is a transaction involved for society in decisions like that. But I think part of the rationale for the discounts for students going in is that they're going to spend more money by the time they get in there, or at least contribute more to the gaiety, the general gaiety of the establishment, perhaps, given that they don't have to get up early for work the next morning. Becky, thank you. That was brilliant. I couldn't have asked for a better call on this subject. And I'm so glad you were listening today. Here's Thomas Watts with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:33 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of university education, its relationship with class, and the mysterious determination of a certain type of Tory to discourage a certain type of Brit from going to university comes under the spotlight today because the new Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology has taken aim, essentially, at the previous administration's claim that too many school leavers go to university. Toby's in Bristol. Toby, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello. My father was a German refugee after the war.
and came to the UK, served, and then got into university and went to Cambridge University.
Gosh.
And my mother was one of the first women to graduate from Glasgow University, similarly through serving. Had 3 children, one of whom myself became a primary school teacher for most of my career. My brother is a neonatal consultant in London in one of the big hospitals. And without their access to higher education, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I wouldn't be, and I don't think we would exist if he hadn't managed to carve out a new life because of free higher education.
Which makes it even more mysterious that anybody would be opposed to it, no? Or is there something in the poor value or the Mickey Mouse argument that says as long as everybody is studying things like medicine and law and classics, then everything's fine. But as soon as you start studying media studies or something that's a little bit more modern, then the rot sets in. And I don't personally think there is much mileage in that, but there might be.
I think if Conservatives were necessarily a big or a small sea of frightened of change, and the world changed around them, and yet their values stay stuck in the past. And as I think your earlier caller, who went on to study the caller before, said, it's not about being taught information necessarily. It's about the access to creative thinking and the access to ideas and other people who think differently from the society that you grew up in, which I think is probably the biggest value that university and tertiary education provides.
And you know, to bang my personal drum, when you look at the breakdown of people who voted in certain ways over recent years, you can see a distinction between graduate educated people, degree educated people and non-degree educated people, the latter of whom are, whether you like it or not, are more likely to vote against their own interests, whether it's on wealth distribution or Brexit. And that might be part of the reason why people who benefit from the things that those people lose out on are keen to encourage them to do so. The tragedy, Toby, and as a primary school teacher, you may appreciate this even more than I do, the tragedy is that the people who are on the wrong side of this imbalance, but think that the imbalance is good. So they think that the university isn't for the likes of them. It takes us back to Gary's point about knowing your place, that the effort put into telling. So people listening to this who think that oh, this is ridiculous. These bloody lefties. My children shouldn't be going to university. They'll probably be eating tofu and reading books.
The entire restructuring of the curriculum that we saw over their period in power lends itself to that idea that the value is in maths and English, and things like the arts, music aren't really.
But they didn't try to hide it.
When are you going to be using these pointless skills? And I think they just literally want a nice, malleable group of people who they can feed information to, and not need to go to university.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think that the next bit from Toby to Tony on the text, what the rich really mean, James, is that they need uneducated people to push the buttons and do the jobs that they don't really want their children to do, which brings AI and immigration into the conversation as well. So a heck of a lot more going on here than you might originally have thought. Where is the next generation of innovation going to come from? Asks Peter Kyle, and he says, not out of a sandwich shop. So we need sandwich shops, we need people to work in sandwich shops. But if you're not encouraging as many people as possible to go to university, then you minimise the chances of having the next generation of innovation coming out of this country. Tony Blair last week, I don't know if you saw my interview or listened to my interview with Tony Blair last week. Very strong on this. Very, very, very persuasive. And remember, he spends time in God knows how many countries on a regular basis. I couldn't actually believe it. I should have picked it up on it more when he said he's been to the Middle East since leaving office, which was only in 2008. He's been to the Middle East more than 270 times. And you do the sums. That's extraordinary, isn't it? But he's adamant that we are world leaders in some of these fields, and to become world leaders in other fields, we need to be bringing people up to the highest possible levels of education, you might think. Tavis is in Aberdeen. Tavis, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Nice to speak to you again.
Is it really again? Because I didn't think I'd seen a name like yours before, but you say you've been on before. My apologies for not remembering, Tavis.
I think I did Mystery Hour about a year ago. I don't expect you to remember me from that. But
no,
I have
maybe not.
chatted to you a couple of times, yeah.
All right, on we go.
Yeah, on we go. Yeah, it's just reflecting that call from Betty was brilliant. I think she hit the nail on the head. I'm in the sector. I'm a professor up in Aberdeen.
Ah, yes.
moved over here from Australia, reflecting on some of my own journey, but also the students, who I've taught and are teaching. And I, came from a working class background. I was the only person in my family to even consider going to uni. I was good at school. I was all right at school, and it opened doors for me. And I almost convinced myself not to go. Just
Why?
From my own head, because I got into a degree in Australia, in good old Tasmania, that was pretty unique and pretty specific.
Okay.
And that question that you always get from your own parents, how are you going to get a job out of that? So the question that comes up. I did Antarctic science in my degree, and I'd convinced myself not to do it. And I went and spoke to the guys, and they said, stick with it. And I tell you what, I've had a lot of different jobs since that, but it's opened so many doors for me from the conversations I've had, and I've got to go down a few times and do that. And now I'm a professor in environmental science and geography in the other side of the world in Aberdeen, and it's just that made me have a really interesting life, and still have an interesting life.
Clearly.
And travel the world and
the push to dissuade people from doing it is a push to reduce the number of people with stories like yours 10, 20 years from now. So it's a welcome intervention. What about, given that you're in academe, what about the people, and we've talked about, to use Becky's phrase, we've talked about learning for learning's sake, and most of us appreciate the value of that, albeit a certain type of, I should say a cynic, I suppose, doesn't. What about the people who do degrees that, in the hope that they will end up in work that is in the same ballpark, and there will be a lot of these people who don't end up working in that field? Is there a case for arguing that we should be educating fewer of them to the level that we currently are?
Absolutely not. I think it is, again, the ability to think around a problem and have other forms of influence in your mind. It's being able to rise above things. It's the ability to be creative. You don't necessarily have to go into a job into the exact area that you studied. But how are we going to encourage the next generation of creative people, of innovators? There is an economic benefit to doing this from people, but I think that's really limited just to see it solely as an economic or a job-based benefit. It's about really, if you want to get philosophical, you've only got one shot in this life, right? So you should do something that you're passionate about, that you love, that you enjoy, and you will open doors and you will find the way if that's who you are. And you need to be true to yourself in that respect. You will find a way through it, whether it's in the field you're studying, whether you're an engineer or a scientist, or whether you're a historian or studying politics, God help us. You will find a way, and I think going through university is as much about discovering who you are as a person, and then getting those critical thinking skills.
And why would anybody be opposed to that?
Why would they?
Well, it's a rhetorical question almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're back to the people who benefit from inequality and are quite happy to leave it exactly as it is. Thank you very much. How often, Tavis, do you go off-piste during your lectures and start giving your students life advice like you've just shared with us?
Every lecture, mate.
I'm in. I'll be in the front row. It's coming up to 11:43. Thank you. There's another line from Peter Carr that just sort of springs to mind in the aftermath of Tavis's contribution. He says, I don't know a single Tory MP who stood up saying that too many people are going to universities who didn't want their own kids to go. So on our list of questions of things that come up surprisingly often when whatever the topic is, some eternal truths, we'll call them the eternal questions, shall we? We'll have our list of eternal questions. Is why do people do the bidding of politicians who want the worst for them in order to hang on to the best for themselves? There's a beautiful example of it. I don't know a single Tory who stood up saying that too many people are going to universities who didn't want their own kids to go, says the newly installed Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. Shah is in Ilford. Shah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time we're talking.
Welcome.
Been listening
First time talking? Yeah. It's a goddamn miracle. I see. Oh, okay. That's fine. I thought we were having an Eddie Murphy moment. Thank you.
Long time. Thank you. You're a beacon.
You're very kind. You're very kind.
I've just taken, I'm a little nervous, obviously, but It's only me. I was just taken by the call, was it a couple of calls ago? A lady called Becky.
That's right, in Brighton.
Yeah, and you picked up on something which was very true. I mean, if she got an offer from Oxford or Cambridge, that makes her incredibly bright. But you said, what about the people who maybe not quite as bright as her? And maybe I think I fit into that category.
So it's just for the record, mate, so do I. So don't worry about that.
Yeah, but talking about class and education and how universities and tertiary education can help, it's certainly got myself and my brother away what would have possibly quite easily been a life of crime.
Gosh.
You know, we were a single-parent family. My mum, we survived on benefits. My mum didn't. We survived on benefits. We were in a council estate. I'm of Pakistani origin, so very, very insular for about 12, 13, you know, from the age of around about 11 till 21, 22, because we were surrounded by racism as well.
Yes.
And the only real way that you either turn to a life of crime or you turn to education.
Gosh, it was that stark.
No, seriously.
And the phone line's a bit rubbish, Shah, which it's not your fault. But what describe the difference that subsequent? So clearly you didn't pursue a life of crime, albeit they're not mutually exclusive, as we'll probably find out if they dig a little deeper into these COVID contracts, which I've got a guest waiting for me to talk about. So how has it changed your life as an adult, do you think?
It's allowed to have a family life. It's allowed me to pursue a career that I enjoy. I get up in the morning and I don't dread my work.
That's interesting.
So
it broadens it broadens your horizons and therefore enhances your expectations. Again, you know, not for everybody. There'll be plenty of people with university degrees listening who ain't getting out of bed in the morning and coming to work. But it increases your chances of ending up where Shah ends up than if he hadn't had that educational opportunity. I mean, imagine if you could translate what they were saying sometimes. Imagine when Rishi Sunak stood up and started talking about poor value degrees. Imagine if you could have just had subtitles saying, down with opportunity for you, up with opportunity for me. It's 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Having a little bit of difficulty making contact with Washington on this occasion, not because we forgot about the time difference. We didn't forget about the time difference. We're not stupid. We just got it wrong. But hopefully we'll be able to do that, because I'm keen to find out more about this Tenet Media story that is not only gathering pace stateside, but possibly has connotations over here and speaks to something that I have been persuaded of for quite a long time, which is Kremlin-sponsored interference in Western public discourse. Because the thing you need to understand about Vladimir Putin, and possibly even the Elon Musk angle that has emerged more recently, is that Putin is probably much richer than Elon Musk. Vladimir Putin is almost certainly the richest man in the world by some distance. And his retention of power, his retention of wealth depends upon his retention of power. And his retention of power depends upon, to a degree, instability in the West, for two reasons. It means that his citizens can't look west and decide that they want a bit of that, as happened in Ukraine, of course. And also because an unstable West, a confused West, is less likely to provide substantive opposition to Vladimir Putin's activities and tactics, which explains the failure of response to his invasion of Crimea. And remember, it's largely by chance that the invasion of Kyiv didn't go exactly the same way. It was an uncharacteristic miscalculation of how easy it would be. He thought if he could remove the elites from the equation in Ukraine, then the population at large would fall into line and embrace their restored Russianness, which was probably one of the biggest geopolitical miscalculations of the 21st century. So you know that I am enduringly fascinated by the possibility / probability of Russian interference in Western public discourse. And this Tenet Media story, which broke in America last week, is particularly fascinating. Will Sommer is the media reporter at The Washington Post, specialising in conservative media and conspiracy theories, and he joins me now. Well, for the benefit of people who haven't been following the story, could we start with a quick idiot's guide, in which I'm more than happy to play the role of the idiot?
Sure, absolutely. So Tenet Media was a sort of YouTube, it was meant to be like a YouTube supergroup of American right-wing YouTubers. And so it was people like Lauren Southern, who is a sort of a big anti-immigrant activist, Tim Pool, who is a sort of like an online chat show host here, and folks like that. And so they produced YouTube videos for this one channel. Last week, it turned out that Tenet Media was a Russian front group, and that people like Tim Pool were being paid unwittingly, according to the feds, huge amounts of money by the Russian government to make these videos. What did the videos have in common? I mean, we could probably join the dots without your help on that, given what you've just told us. But in your own words, what did they have in common? What did these characters have in common? Well, it's interesting. They weren't obviously, I would say, like Russian propaganda. I mean, I was familiar with Tenet Media. I wasn't saying, wow, Vladimir Putin must be paying for this. On the other hand, I think it was all people who have a sort of non-traditional approach to American conservatism, are perhaps people who are sort of ramping up tensions in the United States. It was people who were, supportive of the January 6th riot in some cases, or in Tim Pool's case, someone who's always saying, oh, I think there's about to be a civil war. So I think you can see how that might play into Vladimir Putin's hands. And as you say, it's not just them that claim they had no idea where the money was coming from. The investigation so far seems to support that notion. But how disproportionate were the pay packets for the popularity of the posts that we're describing here? I mean, in other words, if it was me, I'd be going, where the heck is that money coming from? Only 8,000 people watched it or something. Yeah, so in some cases, I mean, it was a huge amount of money. One commentator, Dave Rubin, was making $25,000 per video for these videos where he would sort of dunk on social justice warriors that would get 1,000 views per video. Or in Tim Pool's case, he was getting paid $100,000 per video. And again, practically no one was watching these videos. And yet they're all household names. I mean, they're certainly on your beat. Yeah, I mean, if you're a Trump supporter, I think there's a great chance you're going to know who these people are. And that is another thing that they have in common. They're all sort of on Trump's side of the ticket, quite deeply. Exactly. And all pretty young, I should say, except for maybe Dave Rubin. And so I think that's what's interesting here is they were all brought together by this other influencer, a Canadian woman named Lauren Chen, who is a very popular right-wing YouTuber in her own right. And the indictment suggests that she was very clear that she was working for Russia, and now she has basically disappeared. So I understand everything that you've told me. I think, what are the figures on the number of influencers that have been? Is that the same investigation where I think Wired carried something this weekend, didn't they? Because there's a lot of pages to get through in this. That there are many other influencers who were identified as helpful or sympathetic, even if they weren't actually on the payroll. Right. And so there's a related indictment of sort of a more sort of schlocky fake website network that claims that there were, I think, maybe 1,000 influencers that Russia is keeping tabs on. And it's unclear what that means. I mean, do they just sort of see them as sympathetic to Russia? Are they actually interested in paying them or somehow bringing them into their orbit? How likely do you think it is that the tentacles of this activity have crossed the Atlantic? Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting case because I think here with Tenet Media, these are like pretty big deal people on the right. And so if they were on the Kremlin payroll, as it were, I think it's very likely that this is also the case in the UK. Watch this space. And what about, I think I read about anti-influencers, so people online who are targeted for being on the
on the other side of these arguments would be coming under orchestrated and sort of carefully organised attack.
Yeah, it's interesting. Certainly in the Tenet Media case, I mean, the Russians were really they were saying, you need to put this information out, or you need to attack this person, and so I think that's very possible that there are. And the indictment doesn't get too much into this topic, but the idea that someone who is perhaps really outspoken in favor of Ukraine, for example, could be targeted by these groups.
It feels like the beginning of a process, this will, rather than the end, to me at least. Is it to you? I mean, this is the wheels are now gathering pace.
It does. I think, especially in the United States, I think this is the Justice Department here. I think this is just the beginning of these indictments that are exposing these networks.
And finally, was it Lauren Chen would tell the operatives what to do, and because they. What evidence is there that they would just dance to whatever tune was being played? Do you see what I mean? I've seen at least one clip where there appears to be evidence that one of these people was simply told to please make this point, and then said, okay, here's the point, here's my invoice.
It's interesting. The indictment doesn't have a huge number of examples of these characters saying, yes, Vladimir Putin, whatever you want. And I think part of that's because these guys were already very sympathetic to that cause and didn't necessarily have to be told what to do. They had these Russians in the chat rooms under aliases who would tell people what to do. And so they were directly in Moscow saying, we should really post this video criticizing Ukraine or something like that. So the sort of the command and the control there was very direct.
Finally, Will, an incredibly unprofessional question. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you think my listeners would be interested in learning?
That's a classic question. I mean, there was one funny moment in the indictment where Lauren Chen and her husband, who are ostensibly, they're telling everyone, oh, no, this money is not coming from Russia. They email their investors saying, gosh, we need more money. We're about to collapse. And when they don't hear back in frustration, she Googles time in Moscow. She's sort of like, all right, gosh, is anyone in the Kremlin up right now to read my email?
Which actually speaks to a fairly comprehensive surveillance operation, which means there's probably a heck of a lot more to come.
Yeah, that shows how deep inside they are.
Yeah. Will Sommer, many thanks. Media reporter at the Washington Post, whose beat, as I explained, includes conservative media in general and conspiracy theories in particular, although that Venn diagram looks more and more like a circle on both sides. Well, no, not actually so much on this side of the Atlantic, but where they lead, it seems we often follow. I will be keeping an eye on this, by the way, and attendant stories as well. It's going to become an area of, well, it is an area of particular interest for me. And by the time I'm finished, it will be an area of particular interest for you as well. But I rely upon people like Will to bring us the detail. I may go completely off-piste with the next story because my eye has been caught by a claim that poly-friendly dating is on the rise.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 3 minutes after 12 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to a conversation or a topic that I'm fairly confident we have never been anywhere near before, and I do want to do it in a grown-up way. I've got a couple. I don't know whether it's a sort of mark of my oldest is going off to university this week, so those seem to me to be bigger milestones than ages now. Do you remember when we were younger, when your mum or dad turned 40? It was such a big deal, and I know we still celebrate the big milestones. Of course we do, but in now that I'm a grown-up, allegedly, the things that feel like milestones are not just simple numbers. They're moments, aren't they? The big milestones are moments, right? Obviously birth and death, or first day at school, but when your first child leaves home, essentially, or gets their first job, or in our case this week goes away to university, maybe that's why I'm sort of reflecting on things a little bit more closer to home than I have done in recent years. Or maybe it's the luxury of not having psychopaths and imbeciles running the country, at least for the time being, although fingers crossed. I mention that because I'm looking increasingly at topics where I sort of wonder why I ended up in the place that I ended up. And this is not one of those topics. This is wondering whether I am at some point in the future going to end up wondering how I ended up where I am now. So if you were kind enough to listen to this program 10 years ago, you will know that I was often mistaken for Ian Duncan Smith. No, well, obviously not literally. But when Ian Duncan Smith, or Ian Duncan Donuts as we like to call him, sadly that nickname doesn't really seem to have caught on outside of our little echo chamber. Whenever he talked about marriage, and Ian Duncan Smith is a man who I consider to be wrong about almost everything, with a couple of stopped clock moments, notably with regard to China, actually, and the fate of Jimmy Lai and others. But on marriage, he goes full Victorian. I think he even set up a quotes, think tank end quotes, to promote marriage. If you found me, and since Brexit, you will find it almost impossible to believe what I used to sound like on the subject of marriage. I mean, I was unbearably pompous and smug. Now, all right, you'll find that bit easy to believe, the unbearable pomposity and smugness. But you won't find it easy to believe that I brought my unbearable pomposity and smugness to bear upon the issue of matrimony, the issue of marriage. I would say, and you can tell when a radio presenter is aware, perhaps, that they are being inauthentic, or I meant it. Inauthentic is a sort of therapy term that doesn't do quite what it does in other contexts, where you do that kind of tongue-in-cheek thing, like a sort of Jeremy Clarkson wink to the camera. You say, oh, I'm about to say something outrageous. But you do actually mean it in the moment. Because if you didn't actually mean it in the moment, if I didn't actually mean it in the moment, you would be able to tell. And I would be, therefore, inauthentic in an entirely different way. So I'm being inauthentic because I don't really mean what I'm saying if I dig deep into my motivations for saying it. And actually in my book, How Not to Be Wrong, I look at why I held such commonplace, but I subsequently realised unkind and unfair opinions about marriage. You dig into whatever it was in your past that had led you down this path to false certainty about your new opinion. But if I was saying it for effect, if I didn't genuinely think that I believed it, unless I was a brilliant actor, you would be able to tell, and therefore our time together wouldn't work. You'd be like, no, it's all very well being shocking, but he doesn't mean it. He doesn't really believe that ... He's just saying it for clicks and giggles. He's just saying it for effect. He's just saying it for attention. I think we're usually quite good at being able to tell the people who are saying outrageous things just for attention, as opposed to the ones that think they mean it. But since the pandemic, it's got harder and harder to do, particularly in my line of work, because there's people who are coming out with all sorts of obvious nonsense who look as if they're almost convincing themselves of it as time goes on. But I digress slightly, because I used to be unbearably pompous about marriage. So I would have said to you something like, it's all very well and I'm sure you love each other and you've got 14 children, but your relationship is inferior to mine because you haven't formally recognised it. You haven't stood in front of your God or your family or your friends or a representative of the government. You haven't stood in front of something or someone and said so. We are together forever. Yay. Because you haven't done that, then your relationship, however in love you think you are, however committed you may be, however many houses you may own jointly, however absolutely intertwined your finances may be, although, of course, if you're not married, you can find out when it's too late that there is no such thing really in law as common law marriage. But the point being that I would have been, and I used to upset people, and I used to do it on purpose. People would ring in to tell me that they absolutely don't want to get married and they love their partner more than Romeo loved Juliet, and I'd do little cheeky things like, especially if it was a female caller, I'd go, yeah, but it's just he doesn't want to get married. You've been gaslit. You've convinced yourself you don't want to get married because he is refusing to marry you. And let me tell you why he is refusing to marry you. It's because he's keeping his options open. Even if you've got children and you've got a house, he's keeping the statement of marriage is a statement that you are never, ever, ever going to leave this person. And just because some people break those vows, just because more people than ever before break those vows, does not mean that those vows don't matter. And if you are not making those vows, then you are not making that commitment. And I was being wrong, mostly wrong. And if you do feel special, because quite a few people have got in touch with me subsequently, including a good mate of mine, to say, I used to hate it when you talked about marriage. I thought you were so up yourself. I thought you were such a pompous prick. prig. It was unbearable. It's the only time I've come close to turning you off. And then I got married, and it turns out you were right after all. It does feel completely different. But I think the reason why it feels completely different is because we are all conditioned by the society in which we live. So in an objective universe, if you could start from scratch, if you could somehow deploy a form of John Rawls's veil of ignorance and cloak us all in ignorance, so we know nothing about the world in which we live. And we were asked, here are two people who've been together for 20 years, who have never strayed, who have either, whether they've raised a family or not, whose love is as complete today as it was when they got together 20 years ago, or when they first formalised their relationship by agreeing that they were now exclusive, or they were going out with each other, or they were boyfriend and girlfriend, and they've been together for 20 years, and they are loved up to the eyeballs, and they are fantastic. And then here's another couple in exactly the same circumstances who 5 years into that 20-year period stood up in a building and said, well, hey, we're married. Which relationship is worth more? The first one or the second one? Nobody under a veil of ignorance would say the second one, would they? No one would say, oh, because they made some vows in front of a possibly non-existent deity, or in front of a public official, or in front of two witnesses that they'd never met before, that is definitely a more valuable relationship than that one. And yet, even as I say that, with irrefutable, unimpeachable logic, because I am a victim of society, a product of society, just like you are, I can't shake the conviction, the emotional conviction, that marriage is better. So I was totally wrong, but for reasons. Which brings us to polyamory. So I read today that a dating app aimed at alternative relationships has nearly doubled its revenues. And I nearly changed my mind about doing this during the news, because I thought that the dating app concerned had put out some sort of press release or sponsored some research and succeeded in securing some news coverage. But it's actually a profit announcement. And it doesn't speak of a sea change in social attitudes to relationships, but it speaks of an accelerating popularity of relationships that we would once have considered to be, I think it's fair to say, beyond the pale. So what the dating app does is offer opportunities for alternative relationships, which are described as non-monogamous, queer, and kinky. And by queer, we don't mean, obviously, just same-sex relationships or same-sex marriage. It's. I think you take all three at the same time: non-monogamous, queer, and kinky, which were actually the three dwarves that Walt Disney rejected. Actually, it was going to be. It would have been non-monogamous, queer, and kinky. If it had been Ten Dwarfs, if it had been Snow White and the Ten Dwarfs, they were going to be the other three. That would have been a film, wouldn't it? That would have been a very interesting film. So, what I want to know. And I'm not going to do this in a spurious way. I'm not going to do this like I would have done 10 years ago with a sort of an unspoken and unarticulated snigger going on in the background, because I was categorically wrong about marriage. I was comprehensively wrong about marriage, but my wrongness was a product of my social conditioning. So where does my social conditioning lead me on the question of polyamory, kinkiness and this specific type of queerness? Well, it leads me into a similar place. This is absurd. It's all very well having some fun when you're young, and goodness me, why not get off with as many people as you possibly can, sometimes at the same time? Good luck to you. It's fantastic. But then you will settle down. And when you settle down, you will be in a exclusive monogamous relationship. And I feel today like that, just as I felt 10 years ago about marriage. Therefore, I think fairly obviously, the question becomes, do you think I might be wrong about this as well? Do you think that 10, 20 years from now, the idea of open relationships, multi-partners, lots of people are making parrot jokes because I said the word poly. I really think that is, I don't think that's up to the standards of comedy that we expect on this programme. Nobody's talking about parrot love. We're talking about polyamory. It's a Greek for many, isn't it? Polyamory. Actually, it's quite an odd word, that. Do you know why, Keith? Because I think poly comes from the Greek and amory comes from the Latin. There are not that many examples of that in the English language. Off the top of my head, I can think of one, which would be television. The Greek word for far, telos, and vision, which comes from video videre, meaning seeing. Cost my dad 50 grand, that, you know. Money well spent. So that's what I want to know, is... are these sort of relationships, and the company concerned is called Field, F-E-E-L-D, are founded by a couple who opened up their relationship. Their profits have doubled. They've been quite careful with it. She says, Anna Kirova, who's now the chief executive, said that I don't believe in growth at all costs. We do not pursue that as a business. So they want to get it, right and keep it calm, as it were. But she says our model defies tradition and people are responding accordingly. So this reflects a surging interest in relationship dynamics, such as polyamory. So the romantic unit would be more than two people. 10 years from now, 20 years from now, God forbid, it's unlikely I'm still on air, although I interviewed Tony Blackburn last week, so it's not entirely impossible. 50 years from now, when I'm 102, will I say, I can't believe how pompous and smug I used to be about exclusive monogamous relationships. Happily, I was never one for exclusively heterosexual relationships in the context of my opinions. I never felt that gay people shouldn't be able to get married or that same-sex marriage was somehow wrong or indeed gay relationships. But maybe if I was 20 years older, I'd have been on that journey as well, and I'd have been sitting here in the studio in the 1980s saying, may I just apologise, or in the noughties even, may I just apologise for suggesting that gay people could never have a relationship in the same way that heterosexual people could. Perhaps I even would have said, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. But I didn't, and I hope I wouldn't have done, but you never know. So do you think that this is actually, as a consequence of the social conditioning breaking down, the further we move from the Victorian era, the less straight-laced we become, the less false morality, where everybody marching around condemning other people to damnation when visiting the child brothels on the south bank of the River Thames. Or that completely bogus morality of the Victorian era disappears ever further into the rearview mirror. The social conditioning of the heterosexual marriage being absolutely the gold standard, if not indeed the only acceptable mode of relationship, has disappeared into the distance. Do you think that the exclusive monogamous relationship will, in the future, be as normal now as an unmarried couple is today? So an unmarried couple 40 years ago, almost unheard of. Today, absolutely standard. What about more than a couple? What do you think? 0345 6060 973. And I'm really interested in this for two reasons. Number one, I love social change. I'm fascinated by change. Change is the most interesting thing that humans can do. And number two, I know nothing. I literally know nothing about this. Absolutely nothing. Which means I am, as usual, but even more than usual, relying completely on you and your ability to dial 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Listen, I absolutely mean it when I say I'm going to resist not urge, but I'm going to resist the weakness of being a little bit childish about this. But Keith and I just did have an exchange that I think you'll find quite funny. So Keith can sometimes hear one end of the phone conversations of people who are ringing in, and he just heard one of our colleagues say, so when did you stop becoming a swinger? To which my reply was, well, when I reached the top and had to stop, and that's what's bothering me. That's funny, right? No? Yes, that's objectively funny. Seriously, stick it in the Louvre. We're talking about the defiance of tradition, about an increase in poly-friendly relationships as evinced by the doubling of revenue by a poly-friendly app. Let me read you this from one of my favourite listeners. And I had to ask for a couple of things to be explained to me. Technically, poly doesn't come under queer, but queer relationships are a smidge more likely to be poly. WLW, which means women loving women, in particular are prone to forming polycules. I didn't know that. And they add, I don't make the rules. Open relationships are somewhat different to polyamory, though. Hooking up is for Tinder or Grindr, but poly usually involves feelings, not just... And then there's another acronym that I might need translating for me, but I presume not just, friends with benefits. Oh, that was probably what it means. Yes, exactly. That's what makes poly trickier, but more rewarding. And poly, like queerness, has always been there. It's just been quiet. And they add, I've noticed a social shift in the last 10 years or so. Definitely. Poly is a more common trope in fandom and fanfic now too. And I've been in that world since the early 90s. So are we? I don't think it's going to be as popular or as commonplace as non-marriage couples, unmarried couples. But are we in the process of a significant social change, or are we just becoming more aware of what will always be a relatively tiny fringe? 0345 6060 973. Susie's in Manchester. Susie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I think your listener put some really good points forward there. You and I spoke after the Sarah Everard inquiry. I am a psychotherapist.
Yes, I remember.
But there's kind of personal and professional elements to this for me, because I'm a queer woman who is married to a man, and yet I both support polyamory, not necessarily in my own relationship, but certainly in my practice, where I work with a lot of Gen Z individuals and couples. And I think there is a really important separation that we need to make around queerness and polyamory. And I think that's just because it's really about people's views. And, you know, you kind of mentioned it jokingly before. Oh, you could have loads of relationships all at the same time if you want to, and then you settle down.
Yes.
And there is a conflation around, I think.
That's the point I was making, by the way. I wasn't being wrong on that. I was pointing out that that is at odds with what we're going to be talking about this hour.
It is. It's exactly that. And I think, you know, when I was speaking to your producer, it's about trying to accept something that certainly as a psychotherapist I know and see, that it's really kind of unfair to expect for all our needs to be met in one romantic relationship.
Gosh.
And the most things that we talk about when I work with couples in therapy is that expectation and needing to realign that. And okay, yes, we can say we'll go and do more hobbies, or we'll get a new job, or we'll find other places that we can be fulfilled.
Get an allotment.
Indeed, right? But why does that preclude having other sexual, intimate, close relationships with other people? Why is one more acceptable over the other? And I just think that's conditioning. I just think that's a kind of patriarchal judgment.
So I mean, the thing about conditioning is, in many ways, the same argument as the one about nature and nurture, isn't it? Is how much of it has been imposed upon us, and how much of it has actually been a consequence of a form of social evolution. Like, these things have become the norm because they actually are. They make the most sense, or they are the natural norm for the most people. And what, of course, societies tend to do is demonise other and exclude the people for whom it's not the norm. But it doesn't mean that everybody who is, like me, persuaded that an exclusive monogamous relationship does meet all of my needs. Does it necessarily mean that I've been gaslit, or I've been misled into this position?
I think it's a really good question. You know, I'm 50. I'm married to a man, but I think if I had been born in a different generation, I may well have been much more open about my queerness. I may even have thought I was a lesbian, right? But that's about my social conditioning. And I think if it's important to you, to us, you and I and other people, to be in a monogamous relationship because that ticks our boxes, then sure, that's something that we should work at. But I think younger generations are happier to ask the question about their own sexuality, about trust and consent, because that's really important here.
Absolutely.
Effective polyamorous relationships are all about trust and consent. There's lots of ineffective monogamous relationships where people have affairs and there is no trust and there is no consent. So I think it's more of an awareness and acceptance, and then a willingness to experiment, trying to get our needs met.
And what about the difference between, you used the phrase, actually, you used both words, sexual and intimate, because they can be, well, they are very different things.
Absolutely, for sure. And, you know, that comment from your listener that you did in the preamble to this is about kind of feelings and about shared views and values. And that is very important to some people. Now, just because they might have sex with that person as well, it doesn't mean in the kind of pie chart of what does this relationship mean to me that it's the biggest sliver. And so I think there are some people who absolutely want to just have sexual needs met, but there are other people who want to have relational needs met too.
And I suppose the other historic trope is men's urges somehow being uncontrollable and being greater than women's, and the sort of 1950s model or later of the wife who looks the other way because he can't help himself. That's the opposite of what we're talking about. What we're talking here is about entirely consensual and equal dealings, equal relationships. Again, another old trope of the man who has affairs but would go absolutely ballistic if his wife looked at another man.
For sure, and that all still goes on, but I work with both heterosexual and gay couples, and believe me, there are so many women in both of those scenarios where they want to have sex and their partner, whether that's a man or a woman, doesn't. We all have different sexual energy. It changes over time. We all change in our relationships. The problem is we don't all change at the same pace. Changes
after tea sometimes. Susie. Not just over time. Final question, and forgive me, I'm going to ask this because you're here to help, and I'm very much on the unenlightened side of this thing. But when you describe yourself as queer and married to a gay man, your queerness just means, I think, that you are not exclusively attracted to men.
I'm married to a heterosexual man.
Yes.
But I am queer because I fancy women.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. I was just double checking. Thank you. That was. Oh, and the you mentioned Gen Z. Is presumably the bulk of people coming to you from this space are younger than us, younger than you and me.
Yeah, they are. Although, interestingly, this year I've been working with a lot of women who are yours and my age.
Yes.
And they are thinking about sexuality, coming out of a heterosexual relationship, thinking actually that they might be gay or queer. And when they're doing that, because that's a massive, change for them to get their head around, they're also then thinking about monogamy, and that is an interesting one that seems to be coming up as well.
Wow. I couldn't really have asked for a better caller on this, Susie, so thank you so much. So you've opened up loads, and where you lead, let's see who follows. Susie in Manchester, thank you. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are examining the reality of polyamorous and queer relationships growing in popularity and indeed in participation, and the possibility of society being embarked upon a course that will one day see polyamorous relationships accepted in just the way that more traditional relationships are now, with that little reminder that we used to talk about unmarried couples with an intake of breath and a raising of eyebrows that is now almost entirely absent. A quick and possibly slightly unkind visit to Idiot's Corner for Rob, who says anything goes these days because we live in a godless society, to whom I have to break the news. Mate, there's polyamory in the Bible. I think was it Jacob, Joseph's dad, who could only marry the woman that he fancied if he agreed to marry her older sister as well. So, you've got to do your research if you're going to cite the Bible as evidence for your own bigotries and prejudices, pal. Amelia Cox is here with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:34 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It was fascinating, that conversation we had with Will Sommer from the Washington Post about the increasing evidence of Russian interference in Western public discourse, paying people ludicrously inflated amounts of money to promote talking points and ideas, lies, prejudices, bigotries, whatever it may be, designed to destabilize the West, to increase racism, up to and including racist attacks, of course, which we've seen more of in recent months than in a very, very long time. And it is a hugely important story, but it's also important to bear in mind that some of these people have got, some of the people putting forward some ludicrous ideas hinging upon ethnicity or race or whatever else it may be are just supposedly respectable columnists working for perfectly normal, or once normal, previously normal newspapers, which brings us back to the much-loved feature
Unhinged Headline.
I hope this doesn't come as a major shock to you, but according to Tim Stanley in the, you guessed it, Daily Telegraph, the left is waging war on whiteness itself. So you're just going to have to bear with me and Keith while we check that is the corridor clear for my, because the West is currently waging war on whiteness itself. Are we going to be okay getting out of the studio today, do you think? Well, anyway, fingers crossed.
Unhinged headline.
A quick shout out to the Chief Executive of Transparency International, who is set to join us shortly to discuss the extraordinary investigation they've undertaken into so-called COVID contracts and the possibility stroke likelihood or indeed quantity of them that may turn out to have involved elements of corruption. Because he was enticed into this building under the impression that it was an entirely news-based programme discussing the major issues of the day. So as he sits in the atrium waiting to come in shortly after 1:45, he may be a little bit surprised to hear me reintroduce the current subject of discussion, which is the growing popularity of polyamorous relationships. Eleanor, could you reassure him that I won't be asking him any questions about his own adventures in this field, all right? Or indeed opinions. 12:37 is the time. Matthew is in Sittingbourne. Matthew, what made you pick up the phone?
Basically we've only just started a polyamorous relationship about 6 months ago. When I got with my fiancée, which was about 10 years ago, I already knew she liked girls.
Right.
So as I couldn't then say, we're together, you can't like girls now.
Why not? Because you can't, you can't. You can say to but in a heterosexual relationship, you can say you can't see other boys anymore.
Yeah, but it's a case of if I'm going to get with someone, it's because of who they are and not because of who I want them to be.
Okay. So you'd have had the same attitude if she'd said she wanted to carry on seeing other men, or not?
It's a case of I wouldn't have known.
We don't know, do we?
There would have been a different dynamic then to the start of the relationship, at least.
Yeah.
No, we did do the extra thing with extra people at one point, and that sort of stopped, and then we've sort of settled down into things. She's had 2 other girlfriends while we've been together.
Okay.
They haven't really worked out, but she started doing Twitch streaming about a year ago, and she started watching someone that does Twitch streaming as well, and they got on really well together, and they sort of started, getting a bit close 6 months ago. And then she invited this person over because they live in Norway.
Right.
So 3 months ago they came over. We all had a proper talk about it, and then we've sort of started talking as well. We got my fiancée her passport so she could go over and see her every other month, and then they can come over here every other month. And it's just kind of working.
When didn't it work? When? So what? I mean, it doesn't work indefinitely though, does it? On a monthly encounter. What do you know? What situation the other woman is in? What's her domestic situation?
She's single. She's bisexual, but more leaning towards girls than boys. Which is fine.
And what's the technical term for this? And this would be polyamory. It's a polyamorous relationship, but only one half of it is.
No, we all 3 of us are sort of in the relationship now.
Okay.
Because, like I said, when she first came over, it was just about meeting me and meeting her, and just sort of starting out. And we've gradually, over the last couple of months, talked more and basically played on the PCs more with games and stuff like that.
So where does it lead, do you think, Matthew? Does it lead to, in your mind, everybody living together under one roof, or
We have talked about that.
Gosh.
Because we're planning to move from where we are in Sittingbourne to Walsall, because we've no longer got any friends around here. So we moved down here for my older kids.
Okay.
And now they've moved away because their mum's moved to a different part of the country.
Right, so you've got some big decisions to make life-wise, and you may incorporate your new relationship status into that. How many of your social circle know about this?
Well, most of my colleagues know at work that I'm on the production line with.
Yeah.
My brother knows because they're invited to their wedding as well. Basically, half of my family, the half that are accepting of any of this, no.
Yeah. And you know that in advance. And how sniggery is it at work? How much of the response is supportive? How much of it is a little bit, it's a man and 2 women, so it's fairly easy to predict what some of the responses would be. Although you're describing
I've had a few jokes But like, one of the people who was a line leader then stepped down from line leader, like really talked to me about it. And she's like, she sounded shocked, but she was understanding at the same time. So,
how old are you? How old are you? If you don't mind,
I'm 40.
So, when you were when you were first married, 25? Were you 26?
When I was first married, I was 23.
So, if I'd said to you a year after your first marriage that 16, 17 years from now, you'll be in a polyamorous relationship, would you A, have known exactly what that word meant, and B, have entertained the possibility?
I wouldn't have known what that meant, and I would not have even thought about it.
Which speaks to the question I'm asking, doesn't it? About the sort of wheels of society turning. And if you hadn't met the woman that you're with now, you wouldn't have been anywhere near the situation that you're currently in. It was very much a consequence of who you fell in love with, I think.
Yeah. Well, I've been with my fiancée for 10 years now. We were meant to get married last year, but all of our savings got used up during COVID, so we haven't managed to recover any of that properly yet. So, and then obviously this new relationship, our 2 kids, because we've got 2 kids together, and I've got kids with my ex as well. Our 2 kids know and they love Ellen, who's the girl from Norway. She's planning to move over here, but the only reason she's not moved over yet is because her dad's terminally ill, so she's waiting.
What I'm grateful to you for is the matter-of-factness of the way that you've described your situation, which is really important to the broader conversation. Because if either of us, and you were not likely to do this, but you know, if we got excited or we got outraged, but what you describe is just your life in the same way that you might have been describing going to the shops. That's just how things have transpired. It's how they've panned out. Thank you. And good luck. I mean, seriously, there's quite a lot of potential change, more potential change on the horizon. Thank you, Matthew. Ross is in Sutton. Ross, what would you like to say?
I'm echoing really what Susie was saying a couple of callers ago. I'm personally a gay man, mainly only been in relationships.
Have you done anything to the phone, Ross, since you spoke to the producer? If you have, could you undo it? Do you mind?
Sorry.
That's all right. I think if anything, made it worse. It's extraordinary.
There you go.
There we are.
Hello.
Thank you. Carry on.
Sorry about that.
Start again.
Yeah. So I originally have only ever been in sort of monogamous relationships. A couple of partners ago, they were polyamorous. I was very against it originally, but actually after learning it, like what actually meant, a lot more open, and I think that's a lot of the information, like, that helped, really.
What's the difference, then?
Looking into it.
What's the difference between polyamory and what was certainly once called, and probably still is, just called swinging?
So, I think they're very different in fact. So swinging would be, I'd say, more just sexually based, whereas polyamory is more, I think it's more like, it's relationship based, not just together, but like friends or more than that, but then having to go to
Oh, my fault, making him change his phone line. But that's the point, isn't it? Is that's why this conversation is not what you may have thought it would be when we started having it. It's not about sex. It's a conversation about relationships. And that's why the app that has reported a doubling in its profits talks about keeping things under control, as it were, not chasing endless profits. Because if it's a hookup app, then the sky's the limit. But if it's a relationship app, it has responsibilities to its users that would be betrayed by segueing into just a simple hookup app. I'm so grateful to my callers today. You don't need me to tell you that I'm a little bit out of my comfort zone on this stuff, and it's an area in which I'm highly likely to make any personal investigations or inquiries. But goodness me, it's important, isn't it, to know what's going on around us, not least because it's probably the best available antidote to sort of prejudice and preconception. The time is just gone 12:45. After the break, we're going to find out more about this story that, is approximately, in financial terms alone, 15 times more important than the Labour Party's decision to withdraw winter fuel payments. Corruption, quotes, red flags in government COVID contracts worth more than £15 billion have been uncovered. That means that roughly 1 in every £3 awarded by the Conservative administration during the pandemic falls under this umbrella, according to a newly published detailed study, which we will find out more about after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:48 is the time. Just a little nod back to the conversation we were having previously from David, who makes a really good point, actually, and he makes it very well. He says, I think if this had been socially acceptable for the last 100 years, there would be a lot fewer people suffering from childhood trauma about their parents not getting on, or trying to fit into what is essentially a binary system with people who have a spectrum of wants and needs. So once again, thank you for letting me conduct that conversation in a responsible fashion. This is a big story. Whether it will end up being as big as it should is, of course, a question for the ages. But Transparency International have investigated all of the contracts dished out by the government during the COVID crisis. The investigation the report is entitled Behind the Masks, which is a fairly self-explanatory business. And it is looking essentially at how aligned with acceptable and established proper practice these awards and these contracts were. And that's where the headline today comes from. Study reveals scale of COVID corruption with red flags found in £15 billion. I'll say that again, £15 billion of contracts. And you'll remember that Rachel Reeves' decision to lift winter fuel payments from most pensioners, is scheduled to raise or expected to raise about £1.4 billion. As I say, it's been undertaken by Transparency International UK, and Daniel Bruce is their chief executive, and he joins me now. Daniel, thank you. We should start with what a red flag is, and then work out how significant this is.
Yeah, thanks, James. We developed a list of 14 red flags that were based upon international best practice from the OECD. I won't list all 14, but they fall into a range of categories. So political connections, political donors, the award of contracts through that very controversial VIP lane, which we've heard a lot about in the last few years. Micro companies with tiny balance sheets, given very large contracts, companies that were less than 100 days old. And then I think fundamentally, and this is where a lot of the waste and public frustration comes in, companies that didn't deliver, or they delivered stuff that couldn't be used. And the most egregious cases are where you add all of those red flags together and see a political donor who only got a contract because they knew ex-minister or ex-official got a load of money and didn't deliver the goods, having set up a company just to do that. We're talking about 135 contracts that make up that 15 billion. So actually, in terms of the number of contracts out of the 5,000 we sampled, it's not huge. And we think that is enough for the new government's COVID corruption commissioner to investigate fully.
Because that perhaps was part of the motivation for the previous government to sort of, I think, formally give up on it. Did Rishi Sunak sort of say there's no point looking into this, or that there was a
write-off of about £4 billion of COVID loan fraud, which is slightly different. This is spending on largely PPE, and in the sort of latter phases, we're going out to 23 here, quite a lot of testing contracts as well.
So if it's 135 out of 5,000, if I were minded to spin it for the Tory party, I'd say that's an occupational hazard. That's a margin of error.
But it's a third of the money you spent, 15 billion out of 45 billion. That's the biggest problem. These are incredibly high-value contracts.
So the bigger the contract, the more likely it is to have a Transparency International red flag poking out the top of it this morning.
Yes.
They've all furiously denied throughout any malfeasance, and when they're not denying malfeasance, they make the point that these were desperate times, and in desperate times, you are more likely to turn to people that you know.
You know what? This is the big problem with this argument, is this went on and on and on for month after month after month. The direct awarding of contracts was rapidly given up upon by, say, all the EU member states. And yet we were still doing direct awards and VIP lane contracts when everyone was being encouraged to eat out to help out. We were well beyond the peak of the original crisis.
So the emergency argument quickly lost traction.
Yes, and the VIP lane in particular, which has already been found to be unlawful.
I was coming to that.
We didn't find anything else like that in the world. No other government introduced a mechanism that said, OK, let's get people that we know to refer in. It reduced the defences against possible corruption of public funds. It didn't increase them.
I'm getting a curious mixture of nostalgia and déjà vu for the days when we were up to our ears in these kind of conversations. And I would be taking calls from people, for example, who worked in the area of ventilator supply or who had an established track record of either importing or even manufacturing PPE and who couldn't find anybody to talk to. So that, I know that's not part of your report, but it's important to remember that while VIPs could essentially talk to contract bestowers or decision makers within nanoseconds, people who were eminently more qualified to provide what was needed were struggling to get through to anybody.
And this is where the systemic bias comes in that we've identified in our report. That is exactly a consequence of that approach. Now, government at the time, when we did a preliminary study in 21, denied that. I've seen a response from the Conservative Party today saying all ministers declared their interests, all contracts were awarded properly. The problem with all of that is that the bias and the use of approaches that we would attach red flags to happened before the then contracting process took place.
And of course, it took a very long time for some of these contracts to see the light of day, which probably speaks volumes as well.
Absolutely so.
As if they knew that there would be questions asked.
There was a complete collapse in public transparency. And again, we were just an outlier compared to similar nation states.
And that's the point as well, isn't it? Is the comparisons. In one sense, the people responsible they're no longer in the building. So what are the hopes? Where are you hoping that this report will land?
Well, two things. We do think it's right and proper that the 135 contracts are properly investigated. If there's clawback potential, great. If there is,
what do you think? What are your instincts? Well, not even your instincts. What does your understanding tell you about the possibility of clawback potential?
Well, I mean, there's one known case that the NCA is investigating at the minute to the tune of several £100 million. So maybe a few more of those. It's definitely not the full 15 billion because some of these red flags would be more around political culpability, and for that there should be meaningful accountability. And I think the COVID-19 inquiry, in which we're a core participant in the procurement module next year, is a good opportunity to do that. But the new government's got to learn the lessons from this too. We've made 15 recommendations around procurement reform to prevent a repeat of this in the future.
So what are we looking for in addition to what Rachel Reeves has already announced? Because there's a COVID corruption commissioner set to look at £7.6 billion worth of COVID-related fraud, focusing mostly on the stuff that wasn't fit for purpose. So you just want that person's brief to be extended to include what you've discovered.
Yeah, we'd like them. I mean, we've supplied our list of 135 to the Treasury, to the Serious Fraud Office and the NAO today, so they can take a view on which cases they might want to investigate. I think our sample is producing bigger numbers. We'd like to see them investigated fully.
This is your field of expertise, your livelihood, really, and you can draw comparisons. You have experience that the rest of us don't have. In the sort of annals of potential institutional, governmental corruption, where does this sit? How big a scandal is this potentially?
I think it was a systemic failure. We don't find a conspiracy theory. Right. We don't find a smoking gun, but we find bad decision after bad decision after bad decision. And this is where the public accountability is so important. I don't know why ministers made the decisions that they did at the time, and I think they need to explain it, whether it was an ideology or whether there was something else behind it.
And I suppose the hardest question to ask, let alone answer, would be the likelihood of some of this systemic failure contributing to death, whether or not the failure to secure fit-for-purpose PPE, or whether the scale, because whatever big the margin is on the stuff that you're flogging isn't necessarily because the government is the customer. They're never going to run out of money. That's not going to contribute necessarily to health outcomes, is it? But the companies that weren't supplying decent stuff might have done, or not.
Well, I think this is something that the new phase of the COVID inquiry that's open today can look at. You know, what was the actual harm? And there's crossover between these two things. If you're not getting the goods that you need because there were these systemic failings in the way they were being bought, then actually how did that affect health outcomes?
And again, we would hear from people, actually I'm thinking chiefly of nurses, people in the front line who did not have the kit that they needed when they needed it. And that may turn out to have been due to some of the contracts that you've identified in this report.
I mean, it was globally, it was a very hot market. They were difficult times. But again, just that the UK's sustained approach over time is one which looks increasingly indefensible.
Some food for thought. The most common red flags, the report's authors write, were delayed publication of contracts and those awarded uncompetitively. However, most of these contracts exhibited red flags across multiple areas of risk. Some contracts displayed as many as 8 red flags, and yet you still lean towards the language of systemic failure rather than the language of scandal.
Because they're all quite different.
Okay.
The pattern. So, if corruption is abuse of power, sometimes that abuse could be happening with the person trying to sell the goods. Sometimes it could be happening with a political decision maker.
Got it.
They've all got their own characteristics.
Got it. Thank you. That was really helpful and fascinating, and we'll keep an eye on it because obviously it needs to reach parts that previous reports have not necessarily succeeded in reaching. Daniel Bruce, the Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. And that is it from me for today. If you missed any of the show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you will also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you very much, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.